The strange thing about losing everything is that sometimes the last thing you give away is the thing that changes your life. On the coldest night of November, Emma Hayes stepped out of the back door of Marlowe's diner with the smell of burnt coffee still clinging to her sweater and the ache of a 10-hour shift sitting heavy in her feet. The alley behind the restaurant was slick with rain, the neon open sign buzzing weakly against the dark, and the wind cut through her thrift store coat like it had been waiting all day just for her. She stopped under the flickering light by the bus stop and opened her wallet, already knowing what was inside before she looked. A receipt, an expired pharmacy card, and one silver $50, worn smooth at the edges from years of being turned over in nervous fingers. It had belonged to her mother. Emma rubbed her thumb across the face of the coin and swallowed hard. That 50 cents was not enough to fix her life, not enough to pay rent, not enough to fill the empty fridge in her apartment. But tonight it was enough for one cup of vending machine soup at the station or a cheap ride if she got desperate enough to go somewhere warmer than home. She was still staring at it when she heard a voice behind her, low and careful, the kind of voice that asked permission even when it was asking for help. "Miss, I'm sorry to bother you, but do you have a coin to spare? I'm trying to get to the shelter before they lock the doors." Emma turned and saw him standing just outside the circle of light, tall even with his shoulders bowed against the rain, his coat soaked through, dark hair damp against his forehead. He looked rough, sure, tired in a way that seemed to live deeper than one bad night. But there was something strange about him, too. His words were clean. His posture was almost formal. And his eyes, when he lifted them to hers, did not carry the dull emptiness she had seen in men who had stopped expecting kindness a long time ago. They carried embarrassment. That made it worse. Emma let out a shaky breath and looked back down at the coin in her palm. Her mother used to say that character was what you did when your stomach was empty and nobody was watching. Emma had always hated that sentence because life was easier when your stomach was full. The bus roared past without stopping. Rain tapped against the plastic shelter roof. Her fingers tightened once, then loosened. She stepped forward and pressed the $50 into his cold hand. "It's all I have," she said, almost laughing at the truth of it. The man looked at the coin as if it weighed more than gold. Then he lifted his gaze to her, and for one suspended second, the whole wet, shivering world seemed to go still. "Someday," he said softly, closing his fingers around it, "this coin will find its way back to you." Emma stood there for a moment after he disappeared into the rain, staring at her empty palm like she had expected the coin to somehow return by magic. But the cold only bit deeper now, and reality moved fast when you were broke. By the time she reached the apartment building on Willow Street, her sneakers were soaked through, her hair clung to her cheeks, and the paper bag holding her uniform shoes had split at the bottom from the water. The porch light over the front entrance was out again, leaving the narrow steps washed in moon-pale rainwater and shadows. Emma climbed them slowly, already dreading the sight of her mailbox, because late notices always seemed to arrive on Fridays, always in envelopes that looked too official for lives as fragile as hers. She unlocked the metal box and found exactly what she feared, a folded letter from the landlord stamped final notice in red across the top. Her stomach dropped before she even opened it. Past due rent. 3 days overdue. Full payment required immediately. She closed her eyes and pressed the paper to her forehead for one small second, as if maybe the cool dampness would steady her. Then she reached for her apartment door, slid her key into the lock, and felt it stop halfway. She tried again. Nothing. Her breath caught. She jiggled the handle harder, then saw the strip of white paper tape just above the knob, the edges curling in the mist. Management had changed the lock. For a second Emma just stood there, too tired even to feel shocked. The hallway smelled faintly like old carpet and somebody else's dinner. From behind one of the neighboring doors came the muffled sound of a television laugh track, bright and careless, the sound of people who still had heat and soup and somewhere to sit down. Emma set her bag on the floor and leaned her forehead against the door she could not open. Inside that apartment, there was not much worth saving. A mattress that sank in the middle, 2 mugs, half a loaf of bread, a framed photograph of her mother smiling on a beach in Maine. But it was hers, and tonight, even that felt like too much for life to let her keep. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and for one impossible second, she hoped it might be a miracle. Instead, it was a text from the diner manager. "Do not come in early tomorrow. We are cutting lunch staff." She read it twice, the words blurring at the edges, and then gave a small laugh that sounded nothing like humor. Less work. No apartment. No money. No coin. The rain rattled harder against the windows at the end of the hall. Emma slid down until she was sitting on the floor beside her bag, arms wrapped around herself, trying to hold in the warmth that kept escaping through every crack in her life. She had given away the last thing she had, and now even the place she called home was behind a locked door. Emma did not know how long she sat outside that locked apartment, only that the hallway grew quieter, the television next door finally went dark, and the cold found its way through the knees of her jeans and into her bones until even thinking felt slow. Around midnight, pride gave up before survival did, and she gathered her bag, pulled her coat tighter, and walked back out into the rain. The bus station 3 blocks over stayed open all night, mostly because the city had nowhere else to send people who needed a roof for a few hours without being asked too many questions. Under the harsh fluorescent lights, everything looked tired. A vending machine hummed in the corner. A janitor pushed a mop across the tile with the distant patience of a man who had seen every kind of hard luck and no longer stared at any of it. Emma chose a plastic seat near the window and tucked her bag under her arm, as if a waitress uniform, a paperback novel, and a phone charger counted as valuables. Across the glass, the street shone black and silver under the street lamps, and every time headlights passed, she thought of that man closing his fingers around her mother's coin. Someday, this coin will find its way back to you. It was a strange thing to say, too polished for a drifter, too certain for a man with rain in his hair and nowhere warm to go. Emma leaned her head against the cool glass and almost smiled despite herself. Maybe he had only been trying to make her feel better. Maybe he was one of those rare people who still believed words could carry heat. By 6 in the morning, she had not really slept, just drifted in and out while buses arrived and departed, and a child cried somewhere near the ticket counter. She washed her face in the restroom, twisted her damp hair into a cleaner ponytail, changed into her spare diner blouse, and walked back to Marlowe's with the kind of exhaustion that made the world seem one shade grayer than usual. The breakfast rush had already started. Coffee steamed. Plates clattered. Her manager, Denise, was at the register with a pencil tucked behind one ear and stress written across her forehead. Emma slipped behind the counter and tied on her apron without complaint. She had learned a long time ago that when life was humiliating you, routine could still save you. Half an hour later, just as she was refilling creamers, Denise turned and snapped her fingers. Emma, do not leave after lunch. The Alden Hotel called this morning. One of their banquet servers quit, and they need an extra pair of hands tonight for a private dinner. Black pants, white shirt, hair neat. It pays double. Emma froze with the cream pitcher still in her hand. Double pay meant a motel room. Maybe 2 nights, maybe enough time to breathe. For the first time since the lock had turned against her, hope moved inside her chest, small and shaky, but alive. By 7 that evening, Emma stood in the service corridor of the Alden Hotel with her borrowed black flats pinching both heels and her hands clasped so tightly in front of her that her knuckles looked pale under the fluorescent lights. The hotel felt like another country, all polished marble, quiet chandeliers, and air that smelled faintly of white lilies and money. Men in tailored suits moved through the lobby with the easy confidence of people who had never checked a wallet before buying coffee, and women in sleek dresses crossed the floor as if they belonged in rooms with 10-foot ceilings and gold-trimmed mirrors. Emma kept her eyes down and followed the banquet captain, a sharp-faced woman named Valerie, through a maze of kitchens, linen closets, and private dining halls until they stopped outside a set of double doors. Listen carefully, Valerie said without looking at her. This is not a diner. This is a closed executive dinner. You speak only when spoken to. You move quietly. You do not stare at guests, and you absolutely do not make mistakes. Emma nodded at once, though her stomach had already tightened into a hard knot. Inside the private room, a table for 12 gleamed beneath soft amber light. Every glass lined up with military precision, every fork angled exactly the same way. There were low arrangements of cream roses down the center, crystal water pitchers, folded ivory napkins, and place cards written in elegant black ink. Emma had spent her whole life carrying plates to truckers, office workers, and families with restless children. Here, even the bread plates looked expensive enough to make her nervous. She tried to memorize everything Valerie showed her, where to stand, when to pour, which side to serve from, how to clear without interrupting conversation, but instruction after instruction stacked in her head until she felt one wrong breath away from dropping all of it. When the first guests began arriving, the room changed. Voices lowered. Watches flashed under cuffed sleeves. Laughter sounded rehearsed and careful. Emma moved with her tray exactly as she had been taught, but every step felt like walking across ice. At one point, as she leaned to refill a water glass, a man at the end of the table barely glanced at her before saying to another guest, "Hotels really will hire anybody these days." The sentence was not shouted. It did not need to be. It landed just the same. Emma kept her face still, though warmth rose to her cheeks. A few minutes later, Valerie hissed from behind a service station that Emma had set one appetizer fork half an inch out of line. Half an inch. That was all it took to be reminded she did not belong here. Emma drew a careful breath and looked toward the tall windows where city lights shimmered against the dark like another world floating just beyond the glass. She told herself to make it through dinner, collect the double pay, and survive one more night. Then the room felt unexpectedly quiet, and someone near the doorway said in a tone that instantly changed the air, "Mr. Whitmore has arrived." Emma turned toward the doorway with the water pitcher still in her hand, and for one impossible second the room tilted around her. The man who stepped inside was the same man from the bus stop. The same dark hair, though now dry and neatly styled. The same eyes, steady and observant, though now framed by the kind of calm authority that made an entire table rise to its feet without being asked. He wore a tailored charcoal suit that fit him like it had been made around his shoulders, and the quiet of the room changed shape around him, no longer stiff with money but sharpened by power. Mr. Whitmore, she thought, and then the name landed where the face already had. Ethan Whitmore, founder of Whitmore Capital, the man whose picture had appeared in business magazines near the checkout aisle at the grocery store, the kind of man people described with words like visionary and self-made and untouchable. Emma felt the blood drain from her face. Her fingers tightened on the pitcher. Rain at the bus stop. The $50 in his hand. Someday, this coin will find its way back to you. Around the table, guests began greeting him with polished smiles and practiced warmth, but Ethan Whitmore did not answer any of them at first. His gaze had already found Emma. It held there for one long breath, not with surprise, but with recognition so clear it made her chest go tight. Valerie took a quick step forward, all teeth and elegance now. "Mr. Whitmore, welcome. We are honored to host you this evening." Only then did he glance toward her, offering a brief nod before looking back at Emma. "I see you found someone extraordinary to help serve dinner tonight," he said. The words were quiet, but they carried across the room with perfect clarity. Valerie blinked, uncertain whether she had been praised or corrected. Emma stood frozen beside the table, suddenly aware of every cheap thread in her borrowed uniform, every tired hour under her skin. One of the executives, the same man who had made the remark about hiring anybody, gave a thin laugh and said, "I hope she can manage the basics. We have already had one or two rough moments." Ethan turned his head slowly toward him. No one interrupted. No one reached for a glass. "Interesting," he said, his voice even. "Because in my experience, character shows up long before polish does." The man shifted in his seat. Across the table, somebody lowered their eyes. Ethan took another step into the room, then stopped beside Emma, close enough for her to catch the faint scent of cedar and clean linen, so different from the cold rain and damp wool of that night, and yet unmistakably him. He looked down at her with the same careful steadiness he had shown under the bus stop light. "Good evening, Emma," he said. Hearing her name from his mouth sent a small shock through her. She had never told him her name. Her lips parted, but no words came. Ethan's expression softened just slightly, as if he understood every question racing through her at once. Then he faced the table and said, "Before dinner begins, there is someone here I would like all of you to notice." The silence that followed felt so complete that Emma could hear the faint clink of ice settling in a water glass somewhere near the end of the table. Ethan Whitmore stood beside her, one hand resting lightly on the back of an empty chair, his expression calm in a way that made everyone else in the room seem suddenly restless. "3 nights ago," he said, his voice low and controlled, "I stood outside a bus stop in the rain wearing a coat that smelled like the street and shoes that had seen better years. Do you know how many people looked directly at me and then looked away? No one answered. A woman near the center of the table shifted in her seat. Ethan let the question hang there for a moment before continuing. Do you know how many people treated me as though I was invisible? He glanced across the table, not accusing, simply certain. Almost everyone. Emma could not move. She could barely breathe. Valerie had gone still by the service station, her hands clasped so tightly at her waist that even she seemed afraid to interrupt him. This young woman, Ethan said, turning slightly toward Emma, had less than anyone in this room would consider enough for a single evening. She was cold, exhausted, and carrying the kind of worry that bends a person at the shoulders. And still, she gave me the last coin she had. The words landed harder than anything loud ever could. Emma felt heat rise to her face. She wanted the floor to open and spare her from being seen so clearly, especially by people who had dismissed her only minutes ago. Ethan reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and drew out a small folded handkerchief. Inside it, resting against the white cloth, was the silver $50. Even under the warm dining room light, Emma recognized the worn edges immediately. Her mother's coin. For 1 second the room blurred. Ethan held it, as if it were something rare and breakable. Most people in positions of privilege like to speak about generosity when it costs them very little, he said. I am far more interested in the kind that asks something real. The executive who had insulted Emma lowered his gaze to the table. Ethan folded the handkerchief again, careful and deliberate, and slipped it back into his pocket. Then he looked at Emma, not with pity, but with an attention so steady it felt like respect. Emma, I am going to ask you something in front of all of them, because I want my meaning to be clear. Her fingers tightened around the empty pitcher. If I offered you a place inside my foundation, not as charity, not as a favor, but as a real opportunity to work, learn, and build something that matters, would you be brave enough to step into a world that has not been kind to you and prove that you belong there anyway? The question struck deeper than an offer of money ever could. It was not rescue. It was a doorway. Emma opened her mouth, then closed it again. Fear arrived first, old and familiar, carrying every reason she was not enough. No degree, no connections, no polished resume, just diner shifts, overdue rent, and shoes that hurt after 10 minutes on hotel marble. Ethan seemed to read every one of those thoughts in her face. You would not be handed comfort, he said gently. You would be handed a chance. The rest would be yours to earn. Around them, the room remained silent, but the silence had changed. It no longer felt like judgment. It felt like witness. Emma swallowed hard and lifted her chin just enough to meet his eyes. Somewhere inside the fear, something steadier began to rise. Emma had spent so many years expecting life to close doors in her face that the sight of one opening made her almost step backward instead of through it. The room waited. Crystal gleamed under the chandelier. A server somewhere near the wall lowered a tray without making a sound. Emma could feel every eye on her. But the only gaze that mattered was Ethan Whitmore's, steady and patient, as though he understood that courage sometimes looked less like confidence and more like a person refusing to run. She drew in a breath that felt too small for her lungs. I do not know if I belong in your world, she said honestly, her voice quiet but clear enough to carry. But I know how to work, and I know what it means when somebody needs help and everybody else keeps walking. Something unreadable softened in Ethan's expression, not triumph, not amusement, but recognition. Then you already understand more than most people I interview, he said. A few uneasy smiles flickered around the table, but no one laughed. The balance of the room had shifted too far for that. Ethan turned to Valerie and told her, in the same calm tone he had used all evening, that Emma would be paid for the full shift whether she returned to service or not. Then he looked back at Emma. When dinner ends, my assistant will give you an address. Come tomorrow at 10 in the morning. If you still want to say no after seeing what the work is, you may. He took his seat at the head of the table as though nothing unusual had happened, but nothing in that room felt ordinary anymore. Emma somehow made it through the rest of the dinner on instinct alone. She poured water, cleared plates, and answered quiet requests. Yet her mind kept circling the same impossible truth. The man from the bus stop was not only real, he was powerful enough to silence a room full of executives with a single sentence. By the time the last guest had gone and the roses on the table had begun to lean in their vases, Emma was wrung out from nerves and hunger and the effort of holding herself together. In a small lounge off the corridor, Ethan found her sitting on the edge of a velvet chair with her hands wrapped around a paper cup of coffee one of the kitchen staff had quietly pressed into her palm. Without the crowd around him, he seemed less untouchable and somehow more serious. "You were wondering why I do this," he said. Emma looked up. "Yes." He nodded once, then rested his hands in the pockets of his coat. "Because when I was 16, my mother lost almost everything in less than a year. People who once called her elegant suddenly treated her like she had become inconvenient. I learned very early how quickly kindness disappears when status does." He glanced toward the dark hotel windows, his reflection faint in the glass. "Money tells you what people admire. Loss tells you who they are." Emma stared at him, hearing not a billionaire's speech but something more private, a bruise that had never fully faded. "So you dress like that and walk around testing people?" she asked softly. For the first time, the corner of his mouth moved in the shadow of a smile. "Sometimes," he said, "but I am not looking for perfection. I am looking for one honest act when honesty costs something." Emma lowered her gaze to the coffee cup warming her hands. "It cost me a lot that night," she admitted. "I know," Ethan said. There was no pity in it, only respect, and somehow that made it harder to blink away the sting in her eyes. He stepped closer, but not too close, leaving her room to breathe. "Come tomorrow, Emma. Not because I rescued you. Because I think you might become someone this city needs." She looked up at him then, at the man who had seen her at her coldest and poorest, and still spoken to her, as if she were standing at the beginning of something instead of the end. Fear was still there, familiar and sharp, but beneath it another feeling had begun to take root, fragile as first light. "All right," she whispered. "I will come." The next morning, Emma stood outside the glass tower that held the Whitmore Foundation and nearly turned around twice before the revolving door carried her inside. Everything about the lobby felt too clean, too polished, too far removed from the bus station where she had spent the night before last. But she kept walking because pride had always been easier for her than hope, and she was trying, for once, to choose hope. A woman named Claire, elegant without being cold, met her in reception and led her upstairs to a bright office floor lined with photographs of housing projects, food drives, scholarship ceremonies, and outreach programs that looked impressive in frames and annual reports. By noon, Emma had sat through 2 meetings, filled out forms, accepted a temporary training badge, and learned a truth she had not expected. The foundation did good work, real work, but too much of it was designed by people who had never missed a meal, never slept in a waiting room, never stood in front of a locked apartment door with nowhere else to go. They used words like access and outreach and transition support, yet Emma kept hearing the distance inside those words. She noticed how staff discussed shelter residents as numbers, how they praised efficiency over dignity, how nobody thought to ask what happened to a person between losing a paycheck and losing a home. By the 3rd day, Ethan asked her to sit in on a planning session for a winter assistance campaign. He remained at the end of the conference table in a navy suit, quiet at first, listening while senior staff debated branding, donor appeal, and media optics. Emma kept her pen still, telling herself she was new, unpolished, and lucky just to be there. Then one executive suggested a poster campaign with the slogan "Restoring Hope for the Homeless," and without meaning to, Emma spoke. "People do not stop being people because they are one late rent payment from disaster." The room turned toward her. She felt heat rush to her face, but the words kept coming now because they were true. She talked about restaurant workers whose hours were cut with one text message, about parents sleeping in cars while still showing up in clean uniforms, about shelter curfews that did not fit night shifts, about how shame kept struggling people from seeking help. Until the fall became too steep. "You keep building programs for the moment after collapse," she said, her voice steadier with every sentence. "What about the week before? What about the first notice, the locked door, the person who still has a job but no safe place to sleep? That is where people disappear." No one interrupted. Ethan did not either. He only watched her with that same focused stillness he had carried under the bus stop light, as if he had been waiting to hear exactly this. By the end of the meeting, the campaign had changed. Emergency motel vouchers were added for workers in housing crisis. Transit credits were approved for late shift employees trying to reach temporary shelter. A pilot hotline was created for people facing sudden lockouts before they lost everything. When the others filed out, still discussing budgets and rollout dates, Emma remained seated, staring at the legal pad covered in her own handwriting like it belonged to someone braver. Ethan stepped beside her chair and looked down at the notes. "Do you realize what you just did?" he asked. Emma let out a nervous breath. "Spoke out of turn?" His smile came softly this time, no shadow in it at all. "No," he said. "You gave this place a conscience it was in danger of outsourcing." Emma looked up at him, and something warm moved through her chest, not because he was rich or powerful, but because he had listened, really listened. In that quiet conference room, with winter sunlight spilling pale gold across the table and the city spread wide beyond the glass, Ethan Whitmore was no longer only the man who had tested her kindness. He was becoming the first person in a very long time who saw her not as a waitress, not as a problem to be solved, but as a woman whose voice could change the shape of a room. 6 weeks later, the ballroom of the Whitmore Foundation glowed with winter light and candle-colored lamps, and Emma stood just beyond the stage curtains with her hands clasped so tightly around her note cards that the edges had softened under her fingers. Outside, snow drifted past the tall windows in slow white sheets, turning the city into something almost gentle, and inside, donors, business leaders, and reporters filled the room for the launch of the new emergency housing initiative she had helped shape. It was called First Light because Ethan had said the most dangerous hour in a person's fall was the one just before the world noticed they were in the dark. Emma wore a simple navy dress Claire had helped her choose, and for the first time in years, she was not dressing to disappear. She was dressing to be seen. Still, old fear moved inside her as she waited. Fear remembered locked doors. Fear remembered bus station benches and polite humiliation and the sharp ache of not belonging. Then she heard a voice behind her, smooth and dismissive, and turned to find the same executive from the Alden dinner standing near the champagne display, speaking to another guest in a tone he clearly thought was private enough. "Amazing what passes for an inspiring story these days," he said. "A waitress gets lucky and suddenly everyone calls it leadership." The words struck hard because they landed exactly where her old doubts still lived. For one brief second, Emma felt herself shrink back into the girl with wet shoes and no place to sleep. Then Ethan appeared at her side so quietly she had not seen him approach. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "No," he said, his gaze fixed on the man with calm finality. "Leadership is recognizing value before it arrives in expensive packaging." The executive opened his mouth, but Ethan continued. "And since this foundation is now partnering only with people who understand dignity, your firm will not be joining this initiative after all." The man's face changed color under the warm lights. Around them, conversation thinned and turned. Ethan had not humiliated him for sport. He had drawn a line. That was different, and Emma felt the difference all the way down to her ribs. A few minutes later, her name was announced, and she walked onto the stage with her pulse loud in her ears. The room beyond the lights was a blur at first, but then she saw faces lift toward her, waiting, and she thought of the hallway outside her apartment, the bus station window, the coin leaving her hand. She set her note cards down without looking at them. "There was a night," she began, her voice steadying as it filled the room, "when I had one coin left and no reason to believe life was about to be kind. I thought that coin was too small to matter. I was wrong." Silence held, not empty silence, listening silence. Emma told them what it meant to be one text message away from losing work, one overdue bill away from losing shelter, one hard week away from becoming invisible to people who had once smiled at you. She did not speak like a victim. She spoke like a witness. By the time she finished, there were tears in more eyes than she had expected, and when the applause came, it rose slowly at first, then all at once, until the whole ballroom seemed to lift with it. Later, after the last speech and the last photograph and the final donor handshake, Ethan found her on the quiet terrace outside the ballroom where the air was cold enough to turn her breath silver. Snow rested along the railing, and the city below glittered in clean white lines. He stood beside her for a moment without speaking, as if honoring the size of the night before trying to add to it. Then he reached into his coat pocket and placed a small velvet box in her hand. Emma opened it and forgot to breathe. Inside, nestled against dark blue fabric, was her mother's $50, polished now, but still worn at the edges she knew by heart, set into a delicate silver pendant. She looked up at him, her eyes already stinging. "You kept it," she whispered. "I kept a promise," Ethan said softly. The wind stirred a strand of hair against her cheek, and he lifted his hand as though to brush it back, then paused, giving her every chance to step away. She did not. His fingers touched her gently, warm against the cold. "That night," he said, "you gave away the last thing you had to someone the world had decided was not worth seeing. Since then, you have changed this foundation, changed this city, and if I am honest, changed me too." Emma felt tears slip free, but she was smiling through them now. "I was just trying to help." Ethan's expression softened into something deeper than admiration, something that had been growing in quiet looks and careful conversations and the space he always left for her to choose. "I know," he said. "That is why I fell in love with you." The words settled between them with no grand performance, only truth, and truth had always been the thing that reached her fastest. Emma laughed through her tears, a small breath of disbelief and relief and joy all tangled together, and then she stepped closer. "For the record," she said, her voice trembling in the sweetest way. The millionaire reveal was dramatic. "But I think I like the man in the rain first." Ethan smiled then, fully, like a man no longer hiding from his own heart, and fastened the pendant around her neck with careful hands. The coin rested just above her heart, no longer a symbol of loss, but of return. Below them, the city kept glowing. Inside, the program she helped build was already moving money, rooms, rides, and second chances toward people who needed them before their lives broke apart. Justice had found its way into policy. Kindness had found its way back to her. And as Ethan took her hand in the winter air and held it like something both precious and real, Emma understood that sometimes the smallest thing you give away does not leave you empty. Sometimes it comes back as a future,